And there's other people's stories, but one's pretty far out. It's like Merle got robbed for everything. They lost all their equipment down up in Houston. Bands get pounced on, and somebody pounced on Merle's stuff. So Merle, they lost like great old guitars and like all their stuff, like old, great, beautiful instruments. They're priceless. And Merle called the Bakersfield Hells Angels, and and told him, the guy, whoever that was there, said, "Let me look into it." And they had everything back. Like in 48 hours, they had everything back. So that's pretty cool.
We were playing with Marty Stewart in Northern California, and we had a day off in Redding. And Marty said, came and woke us all up early and said, "Hey, Hag's picking us up and taking us out to breakfast." Sometimes the thing is he would take them to this spot in Redding called Lulu's, this little greasy spoon diner cafe where old men congregate, But this day we were going to go to his home in, I guess it's Palo Cedro, California. So he picked us up, man, and he looked totally gangster. He had a white Escalade, like the pickup truck version of the Escalade, with big rims. And he had this like flat brim, like California people, they wear like their baseball caps with the brim like dead flat. He had that with like this huge like camo kind of overcoat on. Like he looked like a rapper, which kind of makes sense when you think about like his background and sort of the world that he came up in was, I mean, if he had been 50 years younger, that probably would have been more his culture, So he picked us up, this Bakersfield gangster, picks us up in this white Escalade, and all four of us pile in. Marty's in the front seat with Hag, who's driving, and then Kenny and Harry and I are on the back seat. Drives us out to his house. And, that was the only one time I got to really spend, I would say, meaningful time around him. But I'd been in his presence a couple times before, and the thing that always got me was that intensity, like this calm, deep intensity in his stare, in his eyes. Like there was something very deep there that I think anyone who's listened to Merle Haggard has picked up on. But you could see it in him too, So we get to his property, and there's these landscapers there, and they're planting redwood trees, just baby redwood trees, these little things. And he was saying, I think they were like $1,700 a tree to plant. He was kind of complaining about that, but planting like hundreds of redwood trees that day on his property. Maybe not hundreds, but a lot of them. And I was thinking to myself, like, man, you think about what those trees become. You think about those trees when they're 800 or 1,200 years old, and they're, you could carve a tunnel through it and drive a car through. And I was thinking of, I think it's a Buddhist saying, about wise men who plant trees that they know they'll never sit under the shade of. And this was about a year before he passed away. And, I don't think anyone was expecting him to pass right when he did. He'd been sick off and on for years, but no matter what, there was no way he was going to sit under those redwood trees, but somebody will. So we went out to the house. The house was actually Fuzzy Owen's house. Fuzzy Owen was, steel player from Bakersfield and Hag's sort of manager for, many, many years. And it was a very modest place. I don't think it was really a double wide, but it had this kind of fabricated aspect to it. Just this little house on this huge property. And, we had biscuits and gravy and eggs and bacon and sausage and all that. And I'm in the good position of around somebody like him. The country music I love the most is the era before him. So when I was, able to be around somebody like him, instead of asking him about Roy Nichols and recording at Capitol and, Ralph Mooney and all the stuff that, although he probably would have loved to talk about Roy and Ralph Mooney because he was such a fan of Pickers. But instead of asking him about his career, I just wanted to talk to him about like Bob Wills and the Maddox Brothers and Ernest Tubb and Lefty Frizzell. And that's what made his eyes light up, because I've told people for years, in addition to being like one of country music's biggest stars, you're not going to find a country music fan anywhere bigger than Merle Haggard. So I think most of that day we just, kind of talked about the Maddoxes and Bob Wills and sat on the couch and, played some music and got to strum Lefty's Bigsby J200. It's dry out there in California, and the guitar had been in Nashville for years. It was after Lefty died, it was on display at the Country Music Hall of Fame for probably 20 years. And backstory here, one day Marty went to the Hall of Fame and the J200 was gone. And he asked somebody there, like, what happened to the lefty guitar? And they said the family took it back. And he said, we didn't own that. Like, this was back when he was president of the CMF. He just figured that was part of the collection, but it still belonged to the Frizzell family. They listed it for sale at Retrofret in Brooklyn. The family, to the Frizzell family. And I can't remember how much they wanted for it. I think it was like $250,000 or something, a lot of money, which, I mean, I'd say worth every penny. I mean, that's Lefty's, that's the Lefty Frizzell guitar. And it's, and the Bigsby neck on it too, just makes it one of just very few, acoustic guitars in the world of that pedigree. So he called Haggard and said, you need to buy Lefty's guitars at Retrofret. And he kind of talked him into it and played it for him, and then hand delivered it to him out in California a few years earlier. So it had been in California now for a few years. And I think there was a couple like seams that were kind of pulling apart. There was a couple just little things just from being out in the dry California heat, So it comes out in the case, it's not the original case. He takes it out and hands it to me. Haggard just hands me Lefty's guitar. And starts talking about Long Black Veil. And, Lefty played that guitar, I'm sure, on most of those Jim Beck records that were made in Dallas in the, early and mid 50s, like If You Got the Money and I Love You 1,000 Ways and Mom and Dad's Waltz and all of those. But that was, he was proud of that guitar. It's hard to find a picture of Lefty Frizzell where he doesn't have that Bigsby necked Gibson J200. It's almost like a part of his outfit, that guitar. So he starts talking about Long Black Veil. Haggard does. And he says, and a lot of people don't know this, but Grady Martin played rhythm guitar on Long Black Veil. And Grady he didn't have an acoustic with him because he was mostly a lead player. So he played Lefty's Bigsby neck J200. He played that guitar. And he said, strum it. It sounds just like the record. And so I started strumming an E chord, boom, da-da-doon, and he started singing, 10 years ago, on a cold, dark night, there was someone killed 'neath the town hall light. And he was doing it with that Haggard singing like Lefty voice, And to backtrack even further, one of the first moments of inspiration for Haggard in show business was him and a friend went to see Lefty Frizzell play in Bakersfield, and they snuck backstage. And they were kind of hiding behind a plant. I believe this is how the story goes. They're like this fern or whatever backstage. They were hiding behind this plant. And somebody came out, like some security guy, hey, you kids, get out of here. And Lefty was walking by right then. And Haggard's friend said, hey, Mr. Frizzell, my friend here can sing just like you. And Lefty took that J200 and handed it to like a 14-year-old Merle Haggard and said, well, shit, son, then go out there and sing some of my songs. And pushed him out on stage with his band, with his guitar, and he sang 3 Lefty Frizzell songs. So that was kind of like one of the first moments that, and I think later, in prison, he saw Johnny Cash perform. Those were sort of these, cornerstone moments for him. So he had this guitar. So I start strumming that E chord, and he starts singing Long Black Veil. And he gets to the end of the first verse and then kind of stops. And there's that moment, when you're playing music where you're living just on the edge of every moment. Like you can tell, is it going to go to a 4 chord? Is it going to go, where you're very alert when you're playing music, like micro level alert to things within a second. I could tell he was done singing. He kind of turned away and it was time for the second verse. So, or the third verse. So I came in with, the verse where she cries over his bones, the last verse. I'd have to sing through the whole song now to get to that point, but as we had that day, it was on the tip of my tongue. And then he kind of looked over at me and kind of got this kind of grin, but like this grin, like, I don't know. He had that energy about him, like someone who'd been in prison, where like, even if he like had a little bit of a grin, you couldn't tell if he was happy or if he was pissed off, or like if he was, gonna, shank you in the shower later with a, toothbrush knife or something. I mean, I'm not, trying to, he just had that kind of jailhouse, like poker face about him. I don't know, man, those were deep waters, that cat. It was great to play that guitar. And then he had his custom shop Fender Tough Dog Telecaster with the neck through design and the funny pick guard on it. The Merle Haggard telly that he played like the last couple decades. He had his personal one there. And so we sat around, there was a bass, and we just sat around and played music that afternoon. I look back at pictures of it too, and going back to the thing of him being like a gangster, like a Bakersfield gangster, like the pictures, he's got his guitar and I've got Lefty's guitar, which was also his. And then on the coffee table, you see there's like a joint and then a big stack of $100 bills. I was like, yeah, like just sitting there, and then like a legal pad with like some scribbling on it. But it was, I don't know. It was a modest home. It was a very, very modest place. Wasn't putting on any airs in that place. I'd say, that 60s era Capitol stuff is just so good. Anything with like some of the stuff with James Burton is just so great. The stuff with Ralph Mooney, a lot of times I listen to records with the perspective of the pickers on it, which was the same thing that pulled him in too. You could tell that he was always trying to impress Roy Nichols. He looked up to him because he had been the guitar player for the Maddox Brothers and Rose. I'd say, from that, from now on, all my friends are going to be strangers, kind of that era, that early kind of fresh face when it was still coming together, but it was already all there. I don't know. I just love that stuff. And that's the stuff that's got a lot of Ralph Mooney on it. And I don't know. We kind of knew it was coming, playing with Marty because they were so close. Marty presided his funeral. So we kind of knew it was coming. And there was an irony that he passed away on his 79th birthday. There's a lot of contradictions, I think, beautiful contradictions with Merle Haggard. He was kind of this rebel jailhouse outlaw who sang songs about that sort of tugged at people's sense of compassion, like Lonesome Fugitive or Branded Man and tunes like that, where you kind of sympathize with these people who are kind of on the outskirts of society. But then he could kind of like be this guy who towed the line and, held the flag for the establishment with Fight Inside of Me and Okie from Muskogee and all that sort of, there was these contradictions like, well, what is he? Is he an outlaw or is he like this straight-laced guy who's supporting the man? There's a lot of contradictions in his whole thing. And I think that's part of the interesting thing about Merle Haggard. That's what kind of tickles the brain. And I think it was really like the last act of that was the fact that he died on his birthday. Just this like yin and yang thing of Merle Haggard, and he died on his bus. I believe he wanted to be on the bus when he passed, because he was like a lifelong, I guess we're all kind of hobos, musicians, traveling musicians. He just had gotten a new bus too. Really nice bus, like probably cost a lot more than the house cost, and he was proud of it too. And so he was, I believe, on that bus and, laying in the bed. He had given us a tour. He wanted to show us the bus because he was real proud of it. And we were there that day about a year earlier. And the bed, he had a full bed in it. And then above, in this like kind of needlepoint, like old lady looking needlepoint frame over the bed, said, "Nothing gets laid on this bed except Mrs. Haggard." Basically, like, don't put your shit on the bed, So nothing gets laid on this bed except for Mrs. Haggard. And then I laughed, and then I couldn't help but notice something was on the bed, and it was a violin case. I said, "What's in the case?" He said, "Bob Will's fiddle." So there are exceptions.
It's something like you don't want to talk about, brag on, but it's like the one of three talking points that's cool about my life. That's like one of the three cool things I ever did. And it was play harmonica for Merle Haggard on his bluegrass record. And that was all put together by, I believe the bone was thrown to me by Bobby Bear Jr. And so I went in, and it was Ronnie Reno and I can't, maybe it was Marty Stewart producing, I can't remember, or Del McCoury. But I think I only dealt with Ronnie Reno when I went in to record, and because they didn't get the typical, Merle wanted a harmonica sound that was dirty blues or like raw. I guess I took that to mean kind of distorted, overdriven Chicago style blues harp. And because that's kind of what they had me come in and do a little bit. I mean, yeah, it was blues that I was playing on. It was Delmore Brothers and Jimmy Rogers blues, that kind of thing, which he loved, that kind of stuff. And but Merle wasn't there in the studio when I went in, so I was like, dang it. So years passed. The record did come out. It was nice to say that I'm on it. But then I saw that Merle Haggard, this was like the year before he died, so he was coming to Kentucky. He was coming to Beaver Dam, which is not that far from where I live. And I was like, man, this would be my opportunity. If there's somehow I could go meet him. So I texted Bobby Bear Jr. and I said, is there any way that you can get a hold of somebody that can get me backstage or on the bus to just shake his hand, because I was on the record, but I didn't get to meet him. It came out, but, there was no meeting him. There was no party. And so he said, oh, yeah, hold on just a minute. So like maybe 45 minutes later, he called back and said, you're all right. Just tell them at the gate who you are. And that's what I did when I got there. Waltzed right into the bus, and Ronnie Reno was there. He's like, oh, I remember you. And I gave, and there's Merle. And so I got a picture with him, and we talked about the old days, and I gave him one of my barn dance books. That's what brought up the old days. And so I got a little conversation in. I could tell he was real sick at the time too, or he just looked ashen, almost like greenish gray. Like, this guy's not long for this world. And sure enough, it wasn't long after that awesome show, though. I mean, he played fiddle and sang great, but you could tell he was just tired. His body was worn out, and yeah, it was like maybe a few months later, or a year or half a year, he was dead. So I got that in time. Yeah, but it was a near miss. It was like cool, but not cool. And like the whole reason why I wanted to play harp, was to meet him. And then I finally did. So that was a happy ending.
So somehow I just kind of fell into archaeology, going back and finding a lot of these people that had been forgotten forever. A lot of, and it was a lot of American music, jazz, blues, country, rockabilly, rock and roll people. And then No Depression magazine came out. Out of Seattle, Grant Alden and Peter Blackstock. And Grant took a liking to me and understood my plight of trying to get access to these people. And so they didn't have a big budget, but he was great at hiring. He knew exactly what I wanted to do, finding these old people. And he could say, hey, the magazine wants Jim Herrington. So it just gave me carte blanche to go shoot. So he was always, anytime there was an old person, he would hire me. And he had Merle Haggard coming up for an interview. I said, so I got the job, and I went out to Temecula, California, which is where he was playing at a casino gig, but that's where he could do it. So I flew to LA, drove way down to Temecula, and it's just ugly as shit out there, or at least where I went, where the casino was, just this horrible parking lot in a white corrugated metal shed, kind of. But I had my big 4x5 camera. I was doing everything on 4x5 all the time back there, under the blanket, on the tripod. So Merle came out to the bus, or maybe he was already in the bus, and I went to his bus, whatever it was. We ended up in the bus and smoked some pot. And he had to feel me out a little bit. But we got along because, I like music, and I can always talk music, and that's always gotten people to settle down, that I'm not just some guy from Parade magazine or something. Remember Parade magazine, kids? So we had a little dialogue talking about, Bakersfield country and stuff like that. And he's like, okay, this guy's all right. So we went outside, and somebody's kid was out there on a big wheel. And we get off the bus kind of high, and Merle goes and gets on the big wheel. And somewhere I've got pictures of that, but I've misplaced them. I've got Merle Haggard on a big wheel. But anyway, for the cover of the magazine, which should have been Merle on a big wheel, but instead I ended up shooting this photo right over here, over my shoulder. Can we see that in the camera? You have to trust me. And, shooting a big 4x5 camera, those cameras take a lot more light. And so shutter speeds are longer. You need to have it on a tripod. The way that I've always used them is with a very short depth of field, meaning the focus is not deep, it's very shallow. So here I was shooting someone stoned and old And so I had the camera on there, and I always got to tell people, you got to hold really still. Even after I come out from under the blanket, you got to keep holding still. I'm going to close this, open the film, cock the shirt. I'm going to do all this stuff. Keep holding still, and then I'll tell you when. And people can never do this. They're waving, and you always get one in focus shot for 9 out of focus shots. But I did all the thing, turn, cock the thing, and it's like a 1 second long shutter speed because now it's like the sun is already set. I mean, it's very bright California sky, but the sun is already below the horizon. So, and I shoot another one. Anyway, I get them all home when I can really look at them, and every single one of them is laser sharp. He didn't move a muscle. I just remember about Merle, like he went into like some kind of monk state where he, turned into granite. He was, every single one, he didn't move. And he gave me that look, and that, he was good.
What did Grant Alden think when he saw the image?
Put it on the cover. I think he said this needs to be on the back of a buffalo nickel or something like, or the front of where the other side from the buffalo. If we're leaving the buffalo on, put Merle on the other side. I'm shooting, it was going to be nighttime soon, and I'm shooting, I don't even think I took lights. It's really reckless to show up to shoot a job with this big rickety 4x5 camera of a major star. You don't know how they're going to react. I mean, I always had good reactions, but you're very much being specific. There's not a net for that kind of photography, really. So I was always a little bit scared because you just don't know what's going to happen. Things can fuck up easy with this kind of gear and stuff. So, and you don't get Merle Haggard every day. So, and also what I was using back then was this Polaroid that is called Type 55. They stopped making it. It was a beautiful thing, but you would load this film, put it in the film holder, pull the dark slide up, take the picture, usually a slow exposure, put the thing back, pull it through this, like Polaroid, the chemicals get spread through these rollers, and you'd pull it out, ring, hold it for 60 seconds, and then you open it. And with this kind of thing, there was not only a Polaroid, but there was a beautiful negative that came with it, like a real negative on negative film. And you had to put that negative in sodium sulfite, which is basically fixer. So there was just being out in the field, you had to depend on what kind of water you were getting. Sometimes you got like ice cold water and that's all you had, or sometimes you just got hot water and that's all you had. And so these negatives were always like delicate, and you had to get back to a hotel room or sometimes just fly directly. So, it wasn't, it was probably, I think I had a good reaction to some of these pictures, but you just never know. Are they really in focus? Is the negative going to, sometimes there would just be dud negatives that the emulsion would come off. So, at that point I was really good with this material and this film and this camera, but there was still just like stuff that could happen. So I think it was days before it really sank in that I got this. I love the picture now, but it took a while for it to sink in that I got a good picture of him. Is it safe? Did I, And I think it was I think it was hot. I think it was hot summer California, and I think the negatives did get slightly tortured before I could really, because I would usually, you can't leave them soaking forever. So usually I would have to, I would do this stuff in a hotel bathroom. I would have these negatives. I'd have to figure out how to hang them up. I would take clothespins and a string, and I would put them in the bathroom, but then I couldn't use the bathroom because I didn't want dust on it. So it's like I would make sure I use the bathroom before I lock it up. That's what I used to do.
That's beautiful.
Digital photography is for pussies. But yeah, even in the 90s, which that was with Merle, people just, when you break out that 4x5 camera, they feel like they're getting their picture taken. It's like, this is a different thing. And just the process is different because they're used to, come on, baby, or whatever. And this is like, don't fucking move. I'm going away for a while under this blanket. You won't see me for a bit. So I think it shakes him up. I think I think he enjoyed it. I mean, we both got kind of high. Well, neither one of us were talking that much. I think we're just going to, let's do some pictures.
I interviewed him for a feature called Legends of Songwriting for Performing Songwriter magazine before they went under. And it was a phoner, so I didn't get to actually sit down with him. But still, I was thinking about this the other day. There's certain voices when they come on the telephone. You know, I've interviewed Ray Charles, for example. As soon as you hear that voice, it's like, oh my God, that's Ray Charles. I interviewed Barry Gibb last week. As soon as you hear that voice, you know. And Merle Haggard was the same way. It was just that kind of weathered, seen it all, country voice, and it's unmistakably Merle Haggard, you know. We talked a lot about the 60s and 70s, which was kind of, for me, the golden period of Merle. And one story that really is memorable for me is, you know, early on in Merle's life, he was in and out of reform schools and, you know, was always truant at school and getting in trouble. And he was put in San Quentin when he was a teenager for a armed robbery attempt at a restaurant that went awry, you know. And in his first or second year at San Quentin, Johnny Cash came to the prison to perform. And, you know, Merle was already playing guitar and singing and writing songs. And I think, you know, he told me that seeing Johnny in that context was so significant to him that he kind of resolved in the moment, you know, I've been sentenced to 10 years, but I'm gonna get out earlier on good behavior and pursue a career. So after Johnny's performance, Merle was one of the inmates that got to meet him, you know. And I guess, you know, Johnny, being Johnny, said some nice, encouraging things to him. And Merle took it to heart, and he got out of prison about 2 or 3 years later. And as we know, started to pursue a career out of Bakersfield and signed to Capitol in the mid-'60s. Fast forward to 1969, Merle is a guest on the Johnny Cash show. And they're backstage before the taping. And Merle says, John, you're not going to remember this, I'm sure, but we met a long time ago at San Quentin. Johnny's like, what are you saying? I said, yeah, I was doing time. I was in the prison. And Johnny, without missing a beat, said, okay, we're going to talk about this on the show tonight. Because if we talk about it and people find out in a very sort of measured way, you know, with you, you know, explaining it all, it won't be something sensational that tabloids can pick up on and use against you. And Merle told me he was kind of doubtful about it. He said, I don't know if this is a good idea. But Johnny, again, you know, just seized on the moment. They talked about it. And this was, you know, with the Johnny Cash show, they were on a 2-second lag for any kind of things that might be bleeped out or censored. The producers had no idea that this was coming, you know. So here's Johnny like, Merle, we met before, didn't we? You know, at San Quentin prison. And Merle talks about, you know, doing time and getting arrested. But Merle said that really Johnny was right, because the fact that he talked about it on the show, people accepted it. It was never a kind of hidden skeleton in the past, you know. I thought that was really beautiful that Johnny recognized that in a way that he could help Merle, you know, sort of get over this little possible snafu in his career, you know. Also, Merle was really outspoken, as he could be, about things like amphetamines. You know, he was not shy about saying that he used a lot of amphetamines in the mid-'60s. And he said he couldn't deny that it really helped him as a songwriter, because he said, it just gave me a boost of energy and focus. You know, it was one thing to use amphetamines to stay awake on the road when you're driving from gig to gig. But he said, I would not have been as prolific as a songwriter and as good as a songwriter without amphetamines. And then he went one step further, and he said, you know, all these guys today, like Jason Aldean, you know, and they would probably do a whole lot better if they were taking amphetamines, you know. So, you know, there were those moments in the interview where Merle was being Merle, like kind of pushing the envelope, where it's just, that's great copy for a, you know, for a Q&A in a magazine. Anyway, I regret that I never got to meet him, but I'm so glad that I got to talk to him, especially 10 months later he was gone, you know. So just to get to spend a half an hour on the phone with the legend was really meaningful.
So if you were going to listen to some Merle Haggard right now, what would you go to?
I would go to the Swingin' Doors album in 1966. Just, you know, all of that Capitol stuff that he did with Ken Nelson, mid-60s, to me is just flawless. It's the best. It's really the best country music, or my favorite country music. You know, the best is subjective.
Why do you think that stuff is so different than what was coming out of Nashville right then?
That's a good question. I mean, I always think of Merle and Buck Owens as being a little bit more rock and roll and aggressive, especially with the sound of the Telecaster just kind of biting. And also, I remember talking to Merle about this too. I said, what made the Bakersfield sound different than the Nashville sound? And he said it was the twang of the guitars, but it was also the fact that we were coming out of really noisy clubs, working man's clubs in Bakersfield. So we had to be able to cut through the noise. And that's one of the reasons that you have that harmony sound that Buck and Don Rich were so famous for, but Merle too, you know. So I think those two elements, you know, aside from the songs just were a little bit more tough and real, especially with Merle. But that biting guitar and those real high harmonies, it just it's, you know, they used to call it Nashville West, but really it was its own thing. Bakersfield had its own identity.
What was he promoting to do this interview?
That's a great question. I want to say he had a record to promote. I can't think of any other reason that he would have done an interview. You know, it wasn't like he was being inducted. He'd won all the awards by then and been in all the Hall of Fames. So I think it might have been his last studio album. But again, I don't remember the title of it, or I don't remember.
It's a lot of articles.
Yeah, it's a lot of articles ago. Yeah. I was in New York City, I remember, when he passed. You know, part of my other professional life is I'm a songwriter, and it must have been 2016 or 17. I had co-written a record with Teddy Thompson and Kelly Jones called Little Windows, and they were touring for it, and I went up to New York City to see a couple of their gigs. And we were all together. The gig had finished, and we were going out for a drink, and somebody got it on their phone that Merle passed. So all of us loved Merle, so we kind of had a little chance to grieve for him that night.
Do a toast for Merle.
Yeah, a toast for Merle.
The article that you're doing.
Yeah, I could just set up the article for Mojo.
That's cool.
What their intention was in my trip.
Is that a Don Ho?
It's a Don Ho. I've had that for years. I bought that at a thrift store like 20 years ago. It's just one of those things that surprisingly has not broken like most of the glasses that I have, you know. Yeah, Don Ho. Never got to interview Don Ho.
I want to share a fun story with you guys today about Buck Owens and Merle Haggard getting pulled over by the cops. This is out of this book, Buckham, the autobiography of Buck Owens with Randy Poe. It's really good. I talked about it once before. I highly recommend you picking this up. Lots of great stories. And this story begins with Buck Owens meeting Merle Haggard. So the first time I met Merle, somebody brought him over to my house. Me and Don and the guys were getting ready to go out on a 3-week tour, and I'd been told that Merle could play the bass. I liked him right away. At one point, Merle and the fellow who brought him got down on the floor and started doing one-armed push-ups. Do you know how hard that is? Well, I was so impressed that I hired him right then and there. I figured if he could do one arm push up, he was bound to be able to play the bass. I've met a lot of great bass players in my lifetime, and I've met quite a few people who could do one arm push ups. I've never met someone who could do one arm push ups who was a great bass player. So maybe Merle Haggard's that guy. But the story goes on. So Merle joined the band for a short while, and while he was with us, we just had nothing but fun. With Don, Jay, Moose, Merle, and me, we had a really good sounding group. Merle was already a really great singer, so I remember he sang some too on that little tour. We did about 10 dates in Texas, and then we headed up to Michigan. Well, Moose was driving the camper as we came into Michigan. I was sitting in the middle. Merle was sitting next to the door. Don and Jay were sleeping in the back. Think about that. There's 3 people in the front seat, and Buck Owens chose the middle seat. It's his band. Everybody else works for him, and he chose the middle seat. I've never met people who chose the middle seat. But, Buck Owens is not your average person. We were traveling along this 2-lane highway that was real hilly and curvy, but the scenery was nice with beautiful trees on both sides of the highway. Everything was going along real smooth, and then Moose got to talking about Elizabeth Taylor. He was saying how good looking she was, and I was agreeing with him. Well, he got so excited talking about Liz Taylor that he wandered across the double line in the middle of the highway just about 300 feet or so from an oncoming state trooper, who promptly turned around and stopped us. He told us to all get out and had us line up against the camper, which he then proceeded to search. Well, he went into the back and found a couple of Don's .22 rifles in there. Don loved to target shoot when he had a chance while we were on the road, so he always brought these 2 rifles along. Now, I never saw Don get too uptight about anything ever. When that officer started talking about confiscating those rifles, Don just looked at him real calm-like and said, "I can't let you have my guns." It was as simple as that. If Don had gotten all upset and started carrying on, who knows what that state trooper would have done. But instead, he just said, "In that case, put him out of my sight until you get out of my state." That trooper didn't know Don Rich from Adam. Hell, he didn't know who any of us were. But Don was so calm and spoke with such authority that the trooper must have figured Don was somebody he didn't want to mess with. So beyond being a great guitar player who inspired a whole generation of country players to pick up Telecasters, and beyond being an amazingly great harmony singer, I guess Don Rich was a Jedi Master also. These are not the guns you're looking for. But when we got done with Don, he moved on to me. Now, in those days, we didn't get paid with checks. In fact, we wouldn't take checks. When we played a show, we got paid in cash, and I was the one who held on to the cash until we got back home. Here we've been out on the road for around 2 weeks, and we've been getting paid about $500 a night. Every bit of that money was in my pockets and my jeans. So while we were all lined up outside the camper, the trooper said to me, "What you got in those pockets, boy?" I said, "Money." He said, "Money? Let's see it." I began to pull that money out of my front pockets and then out of my back pockets. I just kept reaching in there, pulling more and more money out until the officer said, "Okay, just stay right there. Don't nobody move." He went back to his patrol car and got on the radio to see if there'd been any robberies reported. When he came back, he looked real disappointed. I guess he figured he was just about out of reasons to haul us in, but he still hadn't checked the cab of the camper yet. So he leaned in there, opened the glove compartment, and there was nothing in it but a bottle of those little white pills with crosses on them that Moose took to stay awake. I don't know if he'd brought them back from another one of our trips to Mexico or what, but I knew he sure didn't have a prescription for them. The trooper held up that bottle of pills and looked at Merle. Now, I guess most people know that Merle spent some serious time in San Quentin. He'd only been out a year or 2 at that point, so he was doing his best to look as innocent as possible when the trooper looked at him and said, "What's this?" Merle said, "That's Moose's medicine, officer." The trooper said, "Moose medicine? I never heard of such a thing." "Okay, just put it back in the glove compartment. Everybody get in the vehicle and get out of my sight." It was all we could do to keep from busting out laughing. As soon as we got back in the camper, we were all laughing so hard we were almost crying. I'm sure nobody was more relieved than Merle when the state trooper turned his car around and drove away. Merle was only with us for about 3 weeks. Years later, he'd tell people he only stayed with me for 3 weeks because he couldn't afford to work for me any longer than that. Must have paid bad to work for Merle or work for Buck. That's okay. I can't get mad at Merle for that little insult because he made a contribution to the band that I've always been grateful to him for. And I'm not talking about his bass playing either. Before Merle came along, we were introduced every night as Buck Owens and his band. It was during that short time he was with us that Merle said to me one day as we were going down the road, "You know, Buck, you ought to call your band the Buckaroos." Once again, that's just a little quick passage from Buckham, the autobiography of Buck Owens.
I only met him once at the Fillmore. Dave Alvin and Greg Lease had done a tribute to Merle Haggard, and I was on it. I did Working Man Can't Get Nowhere Today. Tom Russell was on it, and Rosie was on it, Rosie Flores. A lot of other, Billy Joe Shaver was on it. We did some gigs, but we did one at the Fillmore, opening for Merle Haggard at the Fillmore. So it was like the tribute to Merle Haggard opening. So apparently what had happened was Merle Haggard was at a Hollywood press conference where there was like a big like record company version of a tribute to Merle Haggard by all these like big Nashville artists, right? And Merle comes out and he goes, oh, and Iris DeMent was on ours too. And he comes out and they go, what do you think of this tribute to your tribute record to you? And he goes, I love it, especially the Iris DeMent cut. And they were like, no, Merle. And they, it's like, and so like it turned out that what had happened was they said that when ours, I don't know what happened with the other record, I'm sure, but when ours came out, apparently he listened to it and he pulled over the bus. They travel on 2 buses, and there's a bus for the men and a bus for the women. Do you know about that? And so they have 2 buses at this point, and the men had a bus and the women had a bus. And he pulled over and made everybody, he had the buses pull over and everybody had to come in and listen to the whole album. And apparently he like cried at one point, and it was like very intense. And so I played with Merle Haggard. We got to go up, me and maybe like Rosie and probably Dave and Russell. I can't quite remember. I don't remember Dave. He had to have been there, but I mean he was there. But it was his project really. But he had me and I'm pretty sure it was Rosie. And we got up and we sang. I'm trying to remember what song we sang with him, but we sang a few songs with him. And I'll tell you one thing about it. It sounded so cool on stage with him because he had like these fiddle players. The whole thing was like so three-dimensional, like the way the stage sounded. It was one of the coolest sounding stages I've ever been on because Merle doesn't play real loud. And he's one of those guys that like plays and like pulls the whole play. Like at first it seems like he's not playing loud enough, like something's wrong with the system or something. But by the end of it, he just pulls everybody in. And like it's a real talent, for people that do that. And the stage sounded so cool because there was guys like right next to me playing fiddle, and it seemed like there were some guys that he might have met somewhere like in jail or something from the band. I don't know. There were some real tough guys up there, but it was really cool and an exciting moment. And then Billy Joe Shaver just kept on raving about like, man, these people are like, it's like gypsies, man, and all this crazy shit. And then at one point, like, what's the name of that guy that owned that label that Dave was on back then? I can't remember, but the guy, Bruce, I think it was not Bruce. Bruce passed away, but it was this other guy, and they were like notoriously cheap, And so like they owed me like $50 though, and like they swore they were going to pay me back. And so I go up to the guy at the Fillmore. I'm like, I need my $50. He goes, shh. He goes, I'll give it to you, but he doesn't want anybody else. He owes everybody so much money, and he wants me to go behind a wall. I forget that guy's name though. And that was Dave Alvin's record guy who ran his record company for a while. And Tom was on that too, and Rosie was on it too. They were all on it, but it was exciting, working with Merle.
If you were going to listen to some Merle stuff right now, what would be your go-to?
Fugitive, what's that one?
Fugitive.
Snowball to Hell. Working Man Can't Get Nowhere Today. How about, there's a lot of great Merle. There's a lot of Merle that, you know, I like a lot of it. He's a beautiful singer, you know. I like when he covered Lefty. That was really good. And his Jimmy Rogers record is really beautiful. But I don't listen to a lot of Merle all the time, but I really appreciate his band. Norm Hamlet played on, do you know about this? So Norm Hamlet comes in and, well, he's like the guy he was the music director for Merle's band. So we're doing that record now, Let Us Not Praise Sleepy John. I was working with this guy, Ian Brennan. And Ian says, who do you want to play on the record? You know, who do you, let's get somebody really cool to play on the record. So I said, well, how about Pharoah Saunders? We call it Pharoah Saunders, and he's like, Ian calls him up. He's in Sacramento, you know, and he's like 80 years old or something. He's like, yeah, I'd be glad to. Oh, great. $10,000 for a song, you know. Well, we can't really do that right now. Well, so, but anyhow, so he calls, but Ian wants this guy, Norm Hamlet, to come down. I didn't really know about Norm, but Norm was the pedal steel player in Merle's first band that went on the road. And so he came in, and he wouldn't come into Los Angeles. He would only come into way out on the end of the on the edge of the city, like way up the highway, man, like up in the mountains. And he met us out there at that guy Travis Dickerson's studio. There's a guy that recorded Axe and a lot of different people. But so he had a studio out there, so we did that recording out there at Travis's place. And Norm he wouldn't go into the city, but he would drive there from Bakersfield, and he came in there and did it. And he was great, because the song we gave him was a song called Soul Twist, and it's called That Soul Twist, and like it's not conventional. It's weird, you know. And he did a really beautiful job. And like he just played this like really beautiful, heart-wrenching pedal steel on it. And it goes through some weird changes, and he really went through it. So we went through the whole thing with it, and he worked with us. And then we get done, and then we're hanging with him, and he's telling us all about how he, like, when they first went on the road with Merle, there were still guys inside the bus working on the bus, like putting in the bunks and stuff. So that was pretty exciting. And then he told us so many crazy stories about the whole thing.
Good story was one night the promoters throwing things at me from the side of the stage, trying to get my attention. And I look over at him, and he says, 20 more minutes, tell her 20 more minutes. So I told the lead singer 20 more minutes, and she looks at me like, we're done. I said, well, he wants 20 more minutes. So we gave him 20 more minutes. So we came off, and we were like, what's going on? He said, well, Merle's not here. Band's here, but there's no Merle. And so the buses were downstairs in this parking garage. And so I had my little Fender amp and my guitar, and so the Strangers went out and started playing. I think it was Kenny. What was that guy's name? He was fronting the band at the time, singing harmony, and would open the show. And he's out there doing, Heartaches by the Number or Wind Me Up or whatever, It's just the stock country covers, the Merle Haggard show, So I go downstairs to load my amp into the bus with my guitar, and I'm down there. I'm open up the bay, and I hear this horn honking, and this guy gets out of a limousine. And I said, "Hey," he says, "Can you help me out here?" And I close the bay, and I walk up there, and Merle Haggard and Bonnie Owens are in the back of the limousine, drunk. And he says, "Can you help me get this guy up these steps to the stage? Can you show me where the stage is?" I was like, yeah. So we carried Merle Haggard up these stairs, me and this guy, right? And I got him through to the side of the stage, and he brushes us off, and he straightens up his hat and kind of shakes it off a little bit. And he walks out, and they're in the middle of a song, and he walks out on stage and takes his guitar, and he hits this big old E chord. The band stops, and he goes, "Wang!" And he starts singing Folsom Prison Blues, right? And so I was like, oh, shit, I didn't remember if I'd locked the bus or not, So I ran back down the steps, he's in the middle of Folsom Prison Blues. I go back down the steps, make sure the bus is locked, and this lady's trying to stagger out of it's Bonnie Owens, and she says, "Young man, can you help me to the stage, please?" So yeah, yes, Miss Owens. So I carry Bonnie up the steps, this long flight of steps, and she stumbles up there, and she's kind of giggling, and looking a little bit embarrassed, And so I pointed her to the stage, and she walked out there and assumed her place at the microphone, and starts clapping along, and he's still singing Folsom Prison Blues, right? And there was the tour was sponsored by George Dickel Whiskey, and they had these two guys that would walk around backstage. And one guy had a bottle of Jack Daniels, and one guy had a bottle of George Dickel, and they would say, "Now, I'm going to pour you a glass of this Jack Daniels. Now you drink that. Now, I want you drink the Jack. Okay, you drink that. Now, I want you to drink this George Dickel. You can't tell me that Jack Daniels is as good as this George Dickel." Right? And that was their routine, And I quickly figured out that maybe that's why everybody's a little bit drunk on this tour, And so it was a good tour, but anyway, that was the only time I ever saw Merle Haggard inebriated. That was the one and only time I ever saw him that way. He wasn't a big drinker. I don't know if, he never wasn't a big, he smoked a lot of weed, but he wasn't a big drinker. He smoked pot from the time he woke up to the time he laid his head down. When I started playing with Marty, he and Merle were big friends, and we cut a song called Farmer's Blues in the studio down in Cool Springs down there. And there's there used to be a studio down there called the Sound Kitchen. And it was funny because, Marty had it all, he'd written the song with his wife, Connie Smith, and he had it all figured out. And Merle Haggard's supposed to get there at like 6:30. Well, about 6:30, Merle Haggard calls and said, "Hey, can you call the Cracker Barrel and have them cater we're hungry. We're going to be a little bit late, but we'll be there." So it was crazy because, the Cracker Barrel delivers this giant spread of food, enough for like 20 people. And I swear, like right at the time that food got set out, all these people started coming in that I kind of knew, from different areas of the country scene around Nashville, but they were all Merle Haggard people. And they were not in his bus. They were just arriving, And it was like a whole backstage thing going on in the lounge at the Sound Kitchen. There's like 20 people in there, And then his bus pulls up, and then there's another, 6 people that get off just to make Merle Haggard be able to come in and sing. And he, he's a shy guy, kind of self-conscious, uncomfortable in a crowd kind of person. He's not the most social, he's not the kind of guy he's very shy. So he came in and checked everybody out, and we went over the song, and he suggested a few lyric changes. My favorite one is the line is, "The tractor's broke, the fence is down," and Haggard says, "I think, can we change that to, the tractor is old, the fence is down?" And Marty was like, "Yeah, that'll work." I mean, that's Haggard's a wonderful poet. So he. And then I was in the booth right next to him, and I could see him through the window. And I'd never been in the studio with Haggard before. And he stood at the microphone, and he gyrated around when he sang. Like he would like gyrate, it was almost like looking at James Brown or something, singing, and he really threw himself into the performance of the song. And what you hear on the record is that, just that first take, of him singing the shit out of it, it's a little ballad, but and I'm there playing the guitar, looking at him with my headphones on, and he's in my head, and the headphones, I'm watching him, and I'm like, wow, look at that, man. It's Merle Haggard singing. He's very shy and nice and kind of quiet and standoffish, and it took him a long time to where he got to be friends with me, and years later he would talk to me, we'd talk about guitar players and guitar and stuff, music, whatever. He's a music hound, crazy. Last time we were at his house, we took Chris Scruggs with him, and we ended up talking about Bob Dunn, who was the steel guitar player for Milton Brown, and he was a big Bob Dunn fan. Nobody ever played like Bob Dunn. he was like a Dixieland player. And Chris Scruggs went off and with Merle Haggard on this Bob Dunn thing. Why Bob Dunn sounded different from anybody else? Because he listened to, he was a Texan who had heard a lot of Dixieland, and he sounds like a trombone player when he plays the steel, And I was like, you're right. They're right. They're big Bob Dunn fans, those two. I was like, wow,
Is this the picture I saw of Chris with the Lefty Frizzell's
guitar?
guitar?
Yeah. The Lefty Frizzell guitar was the first guitar that Merle Haggard ever played on stage. When he was 16 or 17, his friend, who was a little bit older than him, they went down to this beer garden place near Bakersfield, and I can't play the name of it's a beer garden, and they had shows there. And you can look it up, I think. But anyway, they went down to see Lefty. During the course of the evening, this guy goes and gets Merle, and he drags him backstage, which was probably just where the beer was, back behind the stage, this place, a honky-tonk, glorified honky-tonk, maybe a dance kind of thing, He says, hey, Merle, this guy can sing just like you. And so Lefty handed him that guitar, the Lefty Frizzell. It's a Bigsby neck on a J200 Gibson body. Paul Bigsby put the neck on there and wrote Lefty Frizzell in pearl inlays into the fingerboard, That's a famous guitar. But anyway, he hands him that guitar, and so he said, sing for me. So Merle sang a couple of songs, and I said, what did you sing, man? And he said, I'm not really sure. He said, I can't remember what two he mentioned that probably he sang, but they weren't Lefty songs. So he said, get up there on the stage with my band and go sing a couple of songs. And so Merle, he's holding Lefty's guitar, and Lefty just pushes him up on the stage, and he sang a couple of songs. That was the first time he was ever on stage.
First time he sang into a microphone, even.
Yeah. And so he's playing with Lefty Frizzell's band, playing Lefty Frizzell's guitar. And so anyway, that long story, that guitar ended up at Retrofret in Brooklyn for sale. And they contacted Marty, and Marty said, look, I'm not interested in that guitar because that guitar should be owned by Merle Haggard. And so he arranged for those guys to fly the guitar to Palisadro, where Merle lived out by Reading there. And they took the guitar to Merle's house and made a deal. They they actually lowered the price so he could, have it. And that's where it lives to this day. And that's why Scruggs is playing it in the picture there. We've all played that guitar. I've got a picture of me playing the guitar on my phone here.
How's it playing? How's it sound?
Oh man, it's amazing. It's a 1950 J200 Gibson body, which is the biggest acoustic that Gibson made, and the top of the line. And Paul Bigsby, the great steel guitar builder and electric guitar builder in California, who is really the guy basically responsible for people having pedals on their steel guitar, and the Bigsby vibrato unit, and the Fender headstock, 6 on a side headstock, that all comes from Paul Bigsby, whose shop was right by the Fender's shop. And anyway, Paul Bigsby put that neck on there, which is a Bigsby neck, which is generally they play better than any other necks. They're better made, and he mounted it onto that guitar, and that was Lefty's guitar. Actually, the name is on the pick guard. Now that I think about it, yeah, it's inlaid on the pick guard, and it has the J200 fingerboard, but with a different neck on it. It's really a fast neck. It's like playing an electric guitar, but it sounds like $1 million, man. We would go out there, and anytime we were touring around California, Marty always would like detour and go visit Merle, and we would record with him up at his studio in the back of his house. Sometimes, one time the four of us backed him up, cutting a couple of Bob Dylan tunes. And it was always fun to hang out in his living room, and he'd talk about music with us. We were like his audience, He felt comfortable around us, and he could talk about stuff that maybe he knew that we were just as crazy about the stuff as he is,
Like, what would those subjects be?
Jimmy Rogers, Lefty Frizzell, Hank Williams, Bob Wills, whatever.
Would he sit around and You know how we all noodle on guitar?
Oh yeah,
sitting around?
love to jam. Yeah, we'd sit around and pick with him. Yeah, love to do that. He'd tell stories. We'd ask him questions. He has a good memory for sessions and stuff like that, like who played what on what song and that kind of thing. You know, there's really nothing much to tell, really. I mean, he was a great singer and a great songwriter that had a great band, and it's amazing how long they stayed on the road, you know, from 1965 or 66 till right before he died. Norman was still playing steel. He came on board in 68 when Fuzzy decided he couldn't play steel and manage anymore. And Fuzzy was still there to the, you know, he showed up last time we played in California in Bakersfield. He came to the show, you know. Norman was there at our show. It's amazing that how long, I mean, Merle Haggard wore out a lot of musicians. A lot of them, you know, died, you know, during their tenure as strangers. A lot of them just couldn't handle it anymore. They just had to leave, you know. But Norman hung in there from 68 till, it was only last year, right? Haggard died 16, right? So that's a pretty good run.
Do you remember the last time you saw him?
Yeah, I was up at his house in, right, several months before he passed away. We were at his house.
Was he in bad shape at that point?
Yeah, he wasn't feeling good. He put on a good performance for us that day. He was glad we were there, and he, you know, but I could see it was an effort for him to breathe, even though he was still smoking weed.
That might have made him feel better.
Oh, I'm sure it did. You know, he knew what was going on with himself more than anybody let on, and I think he chose to go out the way he did. You know, I think he could have maybe had some, you know, incredibly invasive operation and maybe prolonged his life, but I think I don't think he wanted to go through that. That's my guess. You know, from reading between the lines, you know, that's what I assume.
When you left that day, did you realize that might be the last time you see him?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we were pretty much convinced of it, I would say, without saying so, you know.
Nobody said it to each other after you left.
No, but, you know, we knew.
Hey, friends, I want to share with you today Merle Haggard's thoughts on modern country music, and then maybe give you some of my thoughts about it. But this is from his memoir, My House of Memories, with Tom Carter. It's very good. It's a little bit dark at times, but I enjoyed it. But Merle Haggard says a lot of people ask him, this is in 1999 when this is published too. A lot of people ask him about his thoughts of modern country music. He says, some music that's being played today is okay. High praise from the Hag there. But how long has it been since you've heard a song that just rattled your cage? How long has it been since you thought, this is going to be another Amazing Grace or Faded Love? There was a time when one of those songs came along every year. Why have the good songs stopped? Now, I would argue to the Hag, respectfully, the good songs haven't stopped, but you know, the big companies stopped getting behind the good songs. It was one of the big problems there, but I'll keep going on. I think it's the mentality of radio programming, which is not set up to rock the emotions of the listeners. There was a time when the song had to explain everything. Today, it takes a camera, a scriptwriter, and a bunch of technicians to explain it in a music video. It's ridiculous. Nothing is left to the imagination. I don't think anything is more boring than perfection. Perfection is achieved almost every day on soap operas, which have the most beautiful people leading the most beautiful lives. I've actually made a video about just that, ranting the same thing, so it's nice to hear my thoughts confirmed by Merle Haggard. But he finishes up by saying, today we have people sitting out there slumped over and looking at a computer and talking to somebody about something that doesn't matter and calling it work. That's how I feel. You can always count on Merle Haggard to give you a piece of his mind and tell you exactly what he feels. Like I said, there's a lot of problems, you know, with modern country, and we could go on about all of that, but now I'm not in the business of arguing with Merle Haggard. I think that what he's saying, there's a lot of wisdom to it. That's 22 years ago, and a lot of that holds true today. Actually, just about all of it. But I'm not the target audience of country music. Whoever they're like aiming it at, I'm not it. And it's been a long time since I was the target audience. Why would I like modern country music? And country music is just a term, come up with by marketing people. Hank Williams was introduced as a folk singer on stage. Bill Monroe was introduced as a folk singer on stage. Just later on, they came up with some different terms because they figured they could sell it. The songs and the artists that you hear for the most part on country radio are just interchangeable widgets. It's stuff that's pumped out there to sell things. It's no different than if you're, selling pimple medicine or if you're selling deodorant. It's just a commodity, and there's big companies selling it. Why would I like that? In all honesty, I haven't liked country music or what gets marketed as country music since 1980. There's been these wonderful blips on the radar since then. People like Marty Stewart, BR549, Dwight Yoakam. But the things that I dig, most of that is just, it's not in this world that's marketed to mass country radio. And I can relate to what he's saying here. Now, there are great, great songwriters out there today, and I will argue with Merle Haggard that there are just as many great songs written now. They just don't have the big machine and the big money and the big publicity behind them. That's just the way it is. But that does not change that there are not great songs out there. What I would like to do is end this with something more positive. Let's share great songs that people might not have heard about. Maybe it's an obscure artist somewhere. Let's not take this as an opportunity to spam with your own band. But if there's somebody else that you dig that speaks to you, name a particular song, and I'll list a few down below myself. And maybe we'll share this with something positive. Maybe we'll get closer to a day and age when Adam Carroll is one of the, is a millionaire because country radio has cut all of his songs. I'd like to live in that world. We could live in a world where Dale Watson is the greatest, the biggest best-selling country singer out there. I'd like that. That would be a very good world, and I would turn on the radio more often if I lived in that world. But subscribe to this channel, click like on this video, and tell me down below, what's a song I need to hear that is a great country song from the last 10 or 20 years. Much love to y'all.